What would you say if I told you there's a secret formula to getting rich? It might look complicated at first, but it's actually really simple. Oh, and before you guess anything, it doesn't involve winning the lottery or buying any kind of meme stocks. On screen now is a formula from a study called Where Does Wealth Come From? It's a paper that followed people from Norway across almost 20 years, some of whom started at 26 and others who started when they were aged 46, to see what kinds of things were important in building wealth. What was really interesting here is that they took into account not only what people earned and saved, but also what they started with, like whether or not they had lots of money from inherited wealth or even other kinds of assets. What they found was very surprising to me, and the results of the study ended up showing us that the most important key to wealth is something that many people don't seem to touch on. Here's what they said in conclusion. Labour income is the most important determinant of wealth, except in the top 1%, where capital income and capital gains on financial assets become important. So, in other words, what you earn through your job was the single biggest factor that decided whether or not you'd be wealthy. It wasn't about how good you were at saving money or how amazing you were as an investor. It didn't matter if you bought coffee at Starbucks every day and ate avocado toast. The biggest factor was your income. Here you can see in the report what they call deep potential wealth and how each different factor made up someone's wealth over that 20 years. Making up the largest part of it by a long way is labour income, i.e. their job. Something like inheritance income doesn't even come close, and there's certainly no lottery winnings in there. Obviously, this doesn't mean they held their wealth in cash, it's just showing where the wealth has come from because you can't buy stocks, property, or any kind of asset without it. Now, you might think that's obvious. If you make more money in your job, of course you get rich quicker because you've got more options. You can get more expensive houses, put more into the stock market, and do whatever else you want. But the thing is, there's so much out there which tells us to save more money, scrimp and save on everything and cut down our expenses, that it makes it out like the only difference between the poor and the rich is how they spend their money. Now, sure, if you make a lot of money and spend it all, you can end up poor. And we've all seen the story of the lottery winners who lose everything in a few years and end up broke again. But generally, the same advice gets rolled out. Save your money and you can be rich. Anyway, once I read that research, I wanted to dive a bit deeper and see if I've missed anything from some of my favourite investing books. The Millionaire Next Door is a classic, and I've referenced this book a couple of times in videos before. It's a little dated because it was published in the 90s, but it's a study of loads of millionaires in the US. It looks at everything from what they did for a living, what cars they drove, and even how much they spent on a typical suit and a fancy watch. When I first read the book, my takeaway was that most rich people got rich by being extremely frugal and careful with their money. In the book, you learn that most millionaires don't spend money on fancy cars, they'll usually drive something second-hand, or if they do insist on having a Mercedes or a BMW, again, it won't be a brand new one, and many of them will pay it straight off in cash.
The place probably's got its own zip code.
Also, another thing is that of all the millionaires they surveyed, most of them lived in the same house for more than 20 years. So much for mansions and Lambos that a lot of people might imagine. Now, obviously, if you make a lot of money, you can save a lot of money. And these millionaires prefer to spend their income on assets like stocks, which could end up gaining value or even paying them in dividends. But after coming across that study we just looked at, I went back into the book to look at their income and not just what they spent, to see if I'd missed anything. So very near the start of the book, on page 8, is what they say is a portrait of a millionaire. It's the average of all of the millionaires they surveyed, as if you can boil them down to one individual. For example, it says, I am a 57-year-old male, married with 3 children. About 70% of us earn 80% or more of our household's income. And then also stuff like 80% of them did not receive any kind of inheritance. And on average, they invest at least 20% of their income. And on that topic, what kinds of incomes are we talking about? Now, it did say that a lot of these people either own their own businesses or worked in professions that were typically highly paid. So the question is, how much did their income affect their future status? Well, according to the Millionaire Next Door, the average household's total annual realised taxable income was $131,000 as a median, and the average is $247,000. Now, those were 1996 figures, and if I adjust that for inflation, we get to around $252,000 today as a median average household income. Again, for some more perspective, US median average income today for a whole household is $70,000, and the top 10% of households make $212,000. So that $252,000 would put you easily up there now today in that top 10% of the country. So sure, if you make a lot of money, you can easily save or invest 20% at least each month, but try doing that with an income where all of your bills eat up everything you make, then it's a very different story. Just for contrast, this doesn't mean that all millionaires are great with their money. The book also focused heavily on the fact that many people with high incomes who would be considered rich were terrible with their money and often had very little left to show for it. In one part of the book, it compares two doctors who worked in similar fields, both making multiple six figures in income. The big difference, though, was one of them was actually wealthy and the other one had just had a large income, and all it was down to was spending habits and lifestyle creep. The wealthy doctor lived in a pretty normal house, didn't drive the latest car, saved and invested lots of his money, and definitely didn't have multiple toys like boats and jet skis. On the other hand, the other doctor had lots coming in, but also lots going out. He had virtually nothing saved for retirement. Flash cars, all the best clothes, a massive mansion, and so on. So clearly, what you save does really matter, and being very careful, or at least frugal with your money, can massively help in building wealth. But how far can the average person take this, and what lessons can we learn? On a side note, I came across this Twitter thread this week. I should really say X now, shouldn't I? It's pretty out of touch, but here's an image that was posted trying to show how the rich stay rich and why poor people stay poor. As you can see, it makes out like all you have to do is stop spending so much money, cut back and just invest everything to stop being poor. One of the people to respond was popular blogger and author Nick Majuli, who I've referenced before on the channel. Now, his response included an image from one user fixing the initial one to reflect properly what should have been made clear in the first place. You see, it's not like everyone's paid the same money and therefore it's just poor choices that make people rich and poor. If you can't cover all of your essential bills with your income, there's no chance you can even think about doing things which help you build your wealth, including saving and investing. Unfortunately, no amount of mindset can buy you food at the checkout, but you're always welcome to try. Now, speaking of Nick, as I was making this video, he made a blog post speaking about this exact topic, and this gives us a little bit more ammo to cover. If you ever want a great blog, this one's well worth subscribing to, ofdollars-and-data.com. His latest post covers this topic really well. Now, a couple of things stand out to highlight this key point about income being a major driver that we forget to talk about. Now, this chart shows exactly what we've just learned. The more money you make as income, the more that is generally saved. Now, for example, those in the lowest bracket have saved an average of just 0.8%, and then those with household incomes of $300,000 to $750,000 can save almost 30% of that income. It's then no surprise when you see how rich people can just keep getting richer because those large sums of money can compound in assets like real estate, stocks, and anything else that generates more money. Then also, check this out, which also backs up this point. Here is a chart from the Consumer Expenditure Survey done again over in the States. Now, we're seeing the same story. The greater the income, the larger rates of saving. Oh, and also, notice how non-auto expenses gradually fall. Now, what this shows is that generally, those who earn more money manage to keep their spending under control and don't go as crazy as those lottery winners who end up broke. So saving money will always be a key point if you have a lot of it, but you can see why it gets a lot easier to do it with a big income rather than a small one. So what now? Are we saying that the only rich people are allowed to make money or invest, or that there's no point even trying unless we live on noodles or beans on toast every night? For the record, beans on toast is great, but you get the point. The thing is, regular people have been able to do some extraordinary things with their money over a long period of time. And if you've watched any kind of investing content before, you'll know how powerful compound interest is on even very small amounts of money. Just diving back into some of my old books up there, there's a couple more stories that come to mind. First up is the life of Grace Groner. Now, she grew up as an orphan in the US and spent her working life as a secretary from 1931. One of the first things she did after saving up some money was to buy some shares of the company she worked at, Abbott Labs, which actually is still running today. She bought 3 shares worth $60 each, which would have been a lot of money back then. Now, the key thing that led to her eventual success, though, was genius. She never sold those 3 shares throughout her entire life, and all dividends she received, she reinvested straight back into getting more shares. What they ended up being worth is pretty incredible. But what was also important in the story was that she lived a very frugal lifestyle, which is no doubt due to her living through the Great Depression, a period in the US following the Roaring Twenties when many people lost their jobs and the stock markets collapsed. When Grace passed in 2010 at the ripe old age of 100, her shares in Abbott Labs were worth more than $7 million. And those 3 shares had turned into more than 100,000 as the company split their stock over years and she'd reinvested to dividends. Nobody even knew about her wealth until she died, as she left the entire amount to a foundation in her own name that she wanted to put towards students at the school that she actually went to. Then there's also the famous story of Ronald Read. This one's from The Psychology of Money, which is an essential read if you're into personal finance. He was another frugal guy who worked fairly low-paying jobs and at one point was a janitor at a supermarket chain. But by buying shares and keeping his costs low over his life, he also amassed millions of dollars by the time he passed away. and nobody would have even guessed how much he was truly worth. Again, just like Grace, Ronald donated most of his fortune to a local hospital and his library. He lived way below his means, and not even his children knew how much he'd stashed away. Anyway, the point here is, yes, having a high income is really important if you want to save and invest your money, but you don't have to be rich in a traditional sense to make money in the long run. It is possible to get rich by being really careful with your money, but you will have to make sacrifices along the way. Grace and Ronald are definitely outliers, but what they do at least show is what's possible if you really focus on something over the long term. But generally, as we've seen from the rest of the data, you want to focus on high-paying jobs and skills because this is going to make your life a lot easier. I think if you're a young person today thinking about what to invest in or whether to put away a small amount of money each month into the stock market, there is an argument that says it might be better to spend that money getting those high-value skills first rather than start investing or saving. If you can get into a high-paying career, that extra money, even if it's a few years later into the stock market, can really make the difference between having a nice retirement and complete financial freedom. Nothing's guaranteed though, and the issue is always going to be holding yourself back from spending too much money on stuff that really doesn't matter. There are way too many stories on the opposite side of the spectrum with high earners who blow all of their money and end up broke. Maybe the answer is a careful balance then, kind of like an equation with both sides evened out. You try and maximise your income on one side, then you spend your money on the other, allowing some left to invest and save. You don't want to spend too much time on just one side though, because life's too short for that. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about what the rich invest in, here's one that shows you exactly what they spend their money on. I think it might surprise you. Till next time, happy investing.